Hello and good evening. Welcome. My name is Simon Houpt and I'm a reporter with the Globe and Mail. Normally I say I'm a Toronto-based reporter, but nowadays in our current state, and perhaps you can all relate, I say actually I'm a Toronto-grounded reporter. And that's why I'm sitting at home rather than enjoying the warm hospitality of McMaster University and the in-person company of all of you tuned in tonight. But though we have all been grounded, our wings clipped like never before, I'm cheered by the fact that if it weren't for our current circumstances, many of you might not have otherwise been able to participate in an event such as this. We're gathered this evening as part of the Socrates Project of McMaster University, a multidisciplinary forum grounded in the spirit of inquiry and creativity that should lie at the heart of a university education. The project's programming is designed to showcase the liberal arts and social sciences in action and to address the critical opportunities and challenges of our time. I'll be speaking this evening with Kate Taylor. Kate is the visual art critic for the Globe and Mail, where she also writes about film and cultural policy. A three-time National Newspaper Award nominee, she won an NNA in 2015 for an investigative project about donations to the Royal Ontario Museum. In 2009-2010, she was awarded the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy Journalism to study Canadian cultural sovereignty in the digital age. Her 2003 novel, Madame Proust and the Kosher Kitchen, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book and the Toronto Book Award. Her second novel, A Man in Uniform, was published in 2010. Her third, Serial Monogamy, is now available in paperback. I'm proud to call Kate a colleague, and frankly, when she's feeling generous, sometimes I even get to call her my friend. Last month, a couple of weeks into Ontario's quarantine period, Kate wrote a piece for the Globe entitled, "Why We Need the Arts Now More Than Ever." That was just as a series of events celebrating the arts, such as the Junos, Canadian Screen Awards, were getting canceled, and other big festivals were days or weeks from getting chopped themselves. The wisdom of her argument has only intensified since then. And with that, I'd like to welcome Kate Taylor. Kate, how are you doing this evening?
I'm great, Simon. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you.
Yes. I am also here in my basement.
You're in your basement, very nice. Well, it's nice to see you at some distance. But with that, if you would like to take it away,
Sure. Yeah.
by all means.
So I guess like everybody else, I'm feeling very anxious about the outside world and worried about the sick and their caregivers, obviously. And then on the other side of it, I have a whole bunch of small, personal, picky complaints to make. And in an attempt recently to try and think a bit more deeply about that and not be so whiny, I started making a list of what do I miss most. I think this is a situation where you start really thinking sort of about the meaning of things and why you do the things you do. And so I started to think, okay, so what is it I really miss in this situation? And the first thing I miss the most is the steam bath at the gym. That was the first thing on my list. And then the second thing on my list was art galleries and museums. I really miss going to art galleries and museums. And as the weeks go by, I miss it more and more and more. And in some ways, thinking of that kind of encouraged me or made me feel more optimistic because I'm an art critic. And I thought, well, that's a good sign. The thing I really miss is doing my job or doing my job to its fullest extent. And so that sort of cheered me up a bit. There has been this very odd paradox that we find ourselves if we work in the arts that I think both of us are experiencing, which is that on the one hand, these sort of mighty institutions that we followed all our careers, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Stratford Festival, the Junos, have ground to a halt. And especially at first, that was really shocking. You know, the notion that the ROM was going to have to close during March break, which is often its busiest week of the year, or that, you know, Stratford's going to cancel its whole season. It seemed really shocking. And of course, the layoffs then just started piling on. And then on the flip side of that, we're all sitting at home, and what is it we're doing if we're not working? Well, we're listening to music, or we're reading books, or we're watching movies or TV shows. And so on the one hand, we're cut off from the arts, and we can't go to the movies, we can't go to the theater, we can't go to a concert or a play, we can't go to a museum or a gallery. And yet on the other hand, the arts are rescuing us, are saving us. It's how we're distracting ourselves and entertaining ourselves and keeping ourselves busy. So there's this odd sort of paradox of the arts being both a kind of us being cut off from it, and also it's saving us. And so that whole situation has me thinking about why the arts. And I have to say, one of the things that drew me to criticism in the very beginning, I mean, when I was a teenager and things, was I was always fascinated by the notion of why the arts, why do people create the arts? And when I was a kid, I was always interested in those sort of mysterious ancient monuments, like the Aztec temples or whatever, the Aztec pyramids. It's like, well, why did these people build these things? And I was also always really interested by cave paintings for similar reasons. I'm just going to share my screen now. I have some slides. They're just really kind of aide-memoire or sort of little trigger cue pictures. But anyway, there, let me just share here, see if I get this right. Oops. There we go. Okay, so that's Lascaux, the cave in France, where they found these remarkable prehistoric drawings. And as I was saying, I've always been fascinated by cave painting, by prehistoric art. I find it deeply touching, I have to say. The notion, I mean, when you think of whatever the society was, all of people's energy and effort and intelligence went into getting enough to eat and finding a safe place to sleep at night. And yet they created this. And so this, it just seems to me remarkable. The other thing that's remarkable about it is whoever these cave artists were, whoever these prehistoric artists were, they pioneered a magic trick in the visual arts that is in operation to this day. And that trick is that you take a two-dimensional line and you make a mark on a two-dimensional surface, a flat surface. The cave wall is more or less flat. An artist's canvas or the piece of paper is flat. So you make a mark on a two-dimensional mark on a two-dimensional surface, and all of a sudden you've represented three-dimensional reality. And as I say, any artist today who paints a representational painting is playing that trick on the eye. And our ability to recognize that, to recognize the two-dimensional as a representation of the three-dimensional, is very ancient, obviously, it exists in the cave art, but it also seems to be really fundamental. And there are psychologists and neurologists who have studied the way babies process imagery and find that children younger than the age of 1 can understand this, and that the cartoon cat in the storybook or on the television screen, that the child understands at a very young age that is a representation of the real cat in the living room meowing. So that seems to me kind of points to the notion that the arts are absolutely fundamental to who we are. And we both appreciate them at a very, very young age, and also that they are very, very ancient. I'm not really following scholarship on prehistoric art at the moment, so this may have changed, but the explanation that was usually given for these cave paintings was that they really, in effect, represented prayers. You see the bison there and the deer, and that this is really a prayer for a good hunt. And so the cave painting represents a sort of form of wishful thinking. And oops, I've gone too far here. Let me just back up a minute. Talking about wishful thinking, I think the most obvious example of wishful thinking in the arts, as a prayer, is the romance, which is an absolutely traditional form, shows up all over the place. This is, I can't remember what this movie is. That's Irene Dunne and Charles Boyer. I think it's called The Love Affair. It's from the 30s. Anyway, a classic romance. And romance, of course, is a form most of us recognize. We all know what's going to happen in the end. And romance is a sort of group form of social form of wishful thinking. I mean, it can be literally if the single person is sitting at home watching the romantic movie, that they are actually wishing for romance in their own life, and are kind of enacting a prayer by watching the movie. But then at a larger, sort of more abstract social level, romance functions as society's wish to spread pair bonding, and therefore family and children and the continuation of the species. So the romance is this really basic pattern that, you know, we're all familiar with. And I think that speaks to another really powerful element of the arts, which I think is a great source of pleasure for many of us, and that's pattern recognition. One of the joys I think many of us take in the arts is recognizing patterns. In the case of the romance, it's a narrative pattern, and there are all sorts of narrative patterns, of course, out in the world, all sorts of genre that we're all familiar with. So that's a narrative pattern, but there are also abstract patterns that I think give humans a great deal of pleasure. If you think of instrumental music, classical music, say, the violins play a theme, and then the woodwinds pick it up, and your ear is pleased by saying, oh, I recognize that. The violins were playing that a few minutes ago. And similarly in visual art, there's a great deal of pattern recognition going on. So if that's a comedy there, the romance is usually a comedy, then the other great, of course, dramatic form is tragedy. And that's the amphitheater at Delphi in Greece, one of the sites where, of course, the ancient Greeks performed their first plays. So the Greeks invented comedy. They also invented tragedy. And the Greek notion of tragedy, of course, is based on catharsis. That is, the crowd gathers to experience some emotion together and in effect to sort of purge something, to get rid of something. For the Greeks, the heroes were often gods. Of course, by Shakespeare's time, the hero would have been a king or a prince or a warrior. And he had some tragic or fatal flaw or made some fatal error. So Hamlet is indecisive. Macbeth is too ambitious. And at the end, we always joke about it, right? What happens at the end? What happens at the end? Everybody dies. And we joke about that, but that's right. It's not a sad ending, it's a right ending. And we know that. And that's why we want tragedy. Because at the end, this fall has marked a kind of purging of this wrong thing, and right has replaced it. So that purging and cathartic element is, I think, visible in all kinds of contemporary art forms. And there's a picture of Hercule Poirot. So there's a picture there of Hercule Poirot because, of course, the murder mystery is a classic example of a sort of purging, a purging of evil. A murder is committed. The detective comes in and finds out who done it. And then the evildoer is pushed out and sent away. And it's not coincidental that kind of murder mystery is sometimes called a cozy. That kind of murder mystery on TV, they are sometimes referred to as cozies. And it is cozy, it's comforting. It's comforting because the right thing happens in the end. Evil is pushed out of society. Another form of purging, of sort of social purgative in the arts, in the movies, is the horror movie. And I don't know about you, but I hate horror movies. I avoid them if at all possible. The few I have seen over the years have often left images in my mind that I can't get rid of, and I sometimes can't get rid of for years. So I always avoid horror movies if possible, but clearly there are people who like them because they wouldn't exist. Otherwise, the studios wouldn't make them. So the usual explanation of horror movies is that they're a way of dealing with our deepest fears in a safe place. So I'm not sure exactly what in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre we might be fearing, but anyway, there's all the different horror movies have all sorts of possible interpretations of what the actual fear it is, home invasion or death or whatever that you're frightened of, is then expressed in this grotesque form. And the watching the horror movie is the way of dealing with that kind of in a safe place. The other thing, of course, that narrative gives us of any kind is meaning. it's a way of taking the chaotic events of life and bringing some form and some rationale to them. And that's why I have the poster for Contagion there. It's a 2011 movie about, you guessed it, a pandemic, and it happens to be doing very, very well on Netflix lately. Clearly, people are turning to it to seek meaning. So that sort of purgative effect I'm talking about, that what happens in the horror movie of you kind of playing with dangerous things or playing with fear in safe places, is, I think, another really important element of the arts, which is that they're a way of offloading risk. And this is a picture of the Cirque du Soleil, and the reason it's there is because there's a sort of expression or piece of wisdom in the performing arts. And the saying is, we go to the circus to see the tightrope walker fall. And that's almost literally true, in that the thrill of a circus acrobatic act is the physical risk the performers are taking. We are not taking that risk. We're not going to fall anywhere. We're going to sit safely in our seat, and they're going to do things that are daring and risky and present physical risks to them. And there are even occasionally deaths in circuses when something goes wrong in a high wire act. So that sense, and to some extent, that is the thrill for us, is the other people taking the risk. So the circus is a very literal physical risk, but I think the arts are engaged in risk-taking at more sort of abstract levels. That's a painting by Kazimir Malevich, the Russian artist who is one of the pioneers of abstract painting. And one of the sort of roles of avant-garde art, such as Malevich's paintings or experimental music, avant-garde writing, is to sort of push society and to take risks that society isn't quite yet ready for. So to push different agendas, to try things out, to experiment obviously with the art form, but to also experiment with social norms and to see what's permissible, what's not permissible. Would this be better? Would that be worse? And there's a very clear link between the avant-garde and social change, and artists and social change. And you see that, Malevich was, of course, an artist of the Russian Revolution. He wasn't painting those paintings for the Tsar. And you see it, gay liberation, I would say, is a really obvious area of social change that has been closely affiliated with the arts. If you think of, say, Oscar Wilde in the 19th century, right up to, say, Andy Warhol in the 1970s. So there's a sense, if I look for a contemporary example, I think the most obvious case right now would be examinations of gender roles and gender, and discussions of whether the notion of binary gender, just male and female, is large enough or complex enough, and the beginning of it, more and more acceptance of trans as a possible gender identity. And I think that you see quite close links between that as a social change and it as an artistic agenda. So looking at that Malevich painting, one of the very common complaints about abstract art is that anybody could do it. A child of 5, that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess anybody could do that, but I guess not everybody can do this. In fact, I think nobody else can do this. That's Simone Biles there, the American gymnast. And the reason I picked a picture from sports here was because I think the relationship here is just very, very clearly defined in sports, but it also exists in arts. And it's one of, the only word I can think of for it is mastery. I think mastering a form is a huge source of power for the artist and pleasure for the audience. And I think we go to sporting events, or we watch sporting events on TV, with huge admiration for the athletes and what they achieve. And in the sports, of course, achievement is absolutely objectively measured. You know, either you win the medal or you don't. Either you won the match or you didn't. You got 10 points or you got 3 points. Or so it's very clear cut. It's much less clear cut in the arts, but I think similarly there is that sense that that the artist masters a form, and that gives the audience pleasure, that the audience admires the mastery, but it also gives the artist great pleasure themselves and a great sense of power. And you talk in music, we talk this Vancouver Symphony. In music, people talk about sort of the musician being one with the instrument or mastering the instrument. So I think that's an extension of that kind of that role that I was sort of talking about in sports into the arts. Music is also, as I was mentioning earlier, I think a great source of patterns, and part of the pleasure of listening to music is pattern recognition. But I think also it goes beyond that, and that for those who truly enjoy it, music can produce an almost transcendent state, a state of kind of removal from the everyday and from the literal into this kind of abstract, transcendent state of being. And the arts historically have always had a very strong connection with religion. And I think there is a sense that the arts are an expression of a desire for transcendence or a reaching for something spiritual or outside ourselves. And of course, the Catholic Church, this is of course the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo's frescoes there. The Catholic Church was of course has always been one of the great patrons of the arts, and there has been this great link between the church and art. And I find the central image here quite interesting because, of course, the arts or Catholic art originally was supposed to be to the glory of God. And if you look at Gothic cathedral, the Gothic cathedral is an expression of reaching for God. It's also an expression of awe, and it will awe the parishioners into the correct sort of attitude towards God, which would be one of awe. But of course, the Renaissance started introducing the human body with more and more naturalism into these pictures. And if you look at the central image of God reaching out to Adam, and those two fingers touching, of course, are key image in Western art that you see repeated all the time. And the notion religiously is that God is animating the human, giving the human life. And yet there's also another way in which in Michelangelo's hands, because he's such a good painter of the human body, it becomes an expression of our reaching for the divine, of the human becoming spiritual. And of course, the Renaissance sort of was known as the moment where human beings began to take center stage and began to become more important than God. So in all these different expressions of the arts and all these different sort of uses and drives that they exhibit, in the current climate, I've started to wonder, well, can we do them alone? Can we do them alone down here in our basement on our computers? Is that enough? Or do we need the crowd? And there's a queue of people on Broadway lining up for the Canadian musical Come From Away. And so do we need to do things in the crowd? And one of the really interesting things, or one of the surprising things for me about the current situation that I've sort of been thinking about a lot, is the way that things I used to think about in the arts that are, I used to think of maybe not as negative, but as sort of things one could dismiss, have been turned on their heads and all of a sudden seem to be quite important. So for example, for decades now, or certainly 20 years, both the symphony orchestras and opera companies have said to their audiences, don't worry about dressing up. It's not stuffy. You don't have to feel you have to get all fancily dressed up. We don't want to intimidate you. And yet in this circumstance, I realized, oh, but the dressing up is part of the point, right? It's an occasion. You put on your fancy clothes. And similarly, when I used to write about theater, if I went to Stratford and saw a play by Shakespeare, one of the things I was looking for was, what's the contemporary relevance of this? Why are we producing Hamlet today? Why are we doing Two Gentlemen of Verona? What's the reason for this play today? And I would say, well, if there isn't some reason, if this production doesn't seem to have some reason other than Shakespeare's a great playwright, so we produce Shakespeare, then this has just become this ritual, and it becomes an empty ritual. And yet, of course, in current terms, I say, oh, well, we're missing that ritual. That ritual is so important of getting dressed up, and it's an occasion and you go out. And I was talking to a musician recently who's had to cancel a whole lot of concerts. And she was saying that the ticket represents a contract between the audience and the performer. And it's a literal contract, of course, and Ticketmaster recently got into some trouble with its policy over whether or not it was going to be refunding people. But it's also kind of a psychological contract. We're both going to show up. This is important. We're going to show up. And one of my problems, I would say right now, with the wealth of material that has become available online is that I don't feel the same commitment. I don't feel the same need to show up. I can watch it in my bathrobe, and I can watch 5 minutes and turn it off, and I can come in and out of the room. And so that ritualistic commitment in some ways makes me pay less attention. The lack of that commitment makes me pay less attention. So when I think about the arts right now, and I think about what we're being offered online and what we're not being offered, I guess the thing I feel we're missing most is community. We're missing the crowd, the annoying person coughing behind you, the smell of sweat at the rock concert, that sense that the audience over there is laughing. What are they laughing at? Oh, somebody new has come on stage. That the power of the crowd and the power of the social experience is obviously what we're missing at the moment. I think that's true. I haven't read the novel The Goldfinch, but several people have pointed out to me that there's a passage in it where the writer says that that when you love a historic painting, you are sharing it with every single person through history who has appreciated it. And so you have this sense of human connection that you're through art. And in the case, of course, of going to watch Shakespeare or something, that becomes the connection is right there in the room with you. The other people who are appreciating it are sitting right beside you. So I think the thing we get most of all from the arts is a sense of community, and of course that's what I'm missing right now, and hope we get back to as soon as possible.
Well, gosh, lots to think about there. And Kate, I should let you know, I dressed up for you. I'm wearing swim shorts underneath it.
Yes, right. They're like the old broadcasters always. It's like the jacket and tie and the sweatpants.
Exactly right. I mentioned that because somebody in the chat, while you were speaking a few minutes ago, did say, I miss dressing up. Why don't we dress up anymore? I miss dressing. And I too miss dressing up, and that's why I've dressed up for you. But I should also note that for those who are tuned in, if you do have questions to ask of Kate, the best place to do that is in the Q&A. Actually, not the best place. The only place to do that is in the Q&A, because we will not be monitoring the chat for those questions. So start pouring them into the Q&A, and in about a half an hour, I will be turning to those questions. For the time being, though, Kate, I get to pester you with my own questions. And so really the first question that I would have is that an original Cave of Lascaux right above you, behind you?
No, that's my husband's. I refer to my husband Joel as a weekend abstract expressionist. And here I can show you. Whoops, no. There we go. There you get a better view of it.
Oh, nice.
It's actually not abstract. I know it looks abstract. It's actually the box of it's supposed to represent the box of a camera, like one of those old cameras with kind of a bellows.
Sure. All right. Well, now you've ruined it for me by interpreting it. So thank you very much.
Sorry.
That's the only thing I can think of. I mean, there's so much to mull in what you've discussed. But let me just first of all ask, what are you? I know you're not dressing up for these events. But what are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you watching? And I guess part of my question is, do you find it helpful to be watching and reading and listening to whatever it is you are consuming? Because it's sort of a drag to have to ask you that, but kind of undergirding the question of, you know, the issue of what are the, you know, why we need the arts more than ever is that we need them. We need them for some sort of helpful reason. So anyway, that's let me. What are you reading, and is it helpful?
Okay. Well, one thing I didn't really include in all my things I went through there, partly I guess because I couldn't include everything, but one word I didn't mention was escapism.
Right.
And obviously the arts transport you to another world. And so that is a roundabout way of saying most of what I am consuming right now is purely escapist, unless it's for work. And I do, you know, the two kind of blend together, right? That I'm quite often, you know, reading stuff that's really, or watching stuff that's really for work. But
right.
If I'm really saying, okay, what am I doing as pure, you know, downtime, me time right now? I mean, I'm watching The Crown on Netflix. I watched this.
Me too, by the way. Great.
So yeah, it's great soap opera, right? And prior to that, I watched this fabulous French series called A Very Secret Service, which I was watching with my son because we need some French class. We need some alternative to French class. And so we started watching, and we had a lot of fun with it. And it had all sorts of political angles, and but he hasn't really got into The Crown, so I do have this very strong sense when I'm watching The Crown of utter, like, guilty pleasure. No one else in the family's watching. This isn't helping anyone else at all. But it's a great soap opera, and so I would say that's more escapist than I usually go, which would make me think that that I'm in need of escape. I've also, for example, been reading, this was sort of coincidental because I happened to be reading them when things locked down, but I have been reading a bunch of thrillers, including the one I just finished with Shari LaPeña's The Couple Next Door. So they're kind of classic modern thrillers, you know, fast moving, fairly tight. And again, I have found myself very mentally distracted. And sitting on my bedside table is Ducks Newburyport. Do you know about Ducks Newburyport?
Yeah. Yes, the one sentence. Yes.
Is this thick. And my sister-in-law, who has an inflated opinion of me, gave it to me for Christmas. And I still haven't really managed to get into it. And the other night, when I finished Shari LaPeña's book about a couple whose baby gets kidnapped, which is a page turner, I said to my husband, I think I'm going to now start to read Ducks Newburyport. And he said, don't worry, the pandemic will be over before you
Before you finish.
Before you finish. So I'm definitely going more escapist than usual.
I mean, what strikes me is that, you know, you said during your talk there that you don't watch horror films. I will have to admit, I'm sort of with you on that. Some of my best friends are horror film aficionados, but I'm not one of them. And yet, you know, by reading thrillers, there is an element, is there not, in kind of what you spoke of, that kind of offloading of risk, putting yourself into that situation?
There is, but in a much gentler way, right? It's, and I think there's a big divide for me anyway between things that are realistic in that this could happen. There's nothing supernatural, and then things in which there are, in effect, supernatural elements or events. And maybe the world divides this way. I'm not someone who's particularly interested in that kind of fiction. I'm not a big science fiction reader. I don't really like apocalyptic fiction, whereas I do quite like political fiction, you know, the political thriller, that kind of stuff. So maybe that's just a taste thing, right? About which way you divide. I mean, I was thinking about escapism, and we tend to, you know, we talk about guilty pleasures, and so we sort of tend to talk about that kind of escapism into popular fiction as something, you know, a little bit sort of down market or negative, or we're slightly ashamed of it or something. But one of the things about that kind of book or movie, since obviously lots of movies that take that form too, is that I was talking about sort of pattern recognition in these absolute traditional forms like tragedy and comedy. Those things have such, one of the reasons they're easy is because they have these forms that we all recognize. And so we know what we're getting in for. And to explore the avant-garde on the totally other side of the spectrum, we don't know what we're getting in for. And that takes some risk on our part too. And so it takes more energy and more effort. And obviously this is a time where a lot of us feel we don't have a lot of energy or effort. Other things are sapping that. The other thing though I was going to say about escapism too is there's all kind of escapism, like listening to instrumental music is for many people a complete escape, right? Because it just takes you into another realm and uses your brain in a different way. So there are also things that we think of as very sort of high-minded in the high arts that I think are also in their way kind of escapist.
I will say I had to smile when you drew a distinction between apocalyptic fiction, which, as you say, you're not a fan of, and political or apocalyptic thrillers and political thrillers, because of course I don't know if you've noticed, Kate. They're basically, they've been pretty much one and the same, certainly certainly for the past number of years, and especially so right now. So, is it, look, as an art critic, and not just a visual arts critic, but as a critic of the arts, is it dispiriting to you that we are asking questions about, especially at this moment, how is art helping us? Because it seems somehow, I don't know, am I crazy to say? It seems kind of base. Like literally Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this notion that art could somehow feed us in a very basic fashion.
Yeah. So I guess they're these kind of chicken and egg things, right? Or maybe it's not chicken and egg. It's what's that thing about if you justify something if you explain something too much, you start to justify it, and maybe you don't want to justify it. You're just trying to explain it. I mean, sort of like people get into that argument over crime, kind of, and I certainly worried in preparing what I said that perhaps I was getting into that thing where it becomes sort of utilitarian, and you say, well, no, it's not we need the arts for art's sake. It's that we need the arts for the following psychological or mental reasons. I was fascinated by the way society continues to create art and seems to continue to need it. But that said, I'm also slightly alarmed by a kind of utilitarian kind of approach that's increasingly being taken to justify the arts, and especially to justify. It's always about funding, right? It's sort of, and we're now in a situation where bailouts are going to be needed. So this conversation will keep going. So the arts for several decades tended to use the economic argument. We create jobs. And you
economic spin-offs, and we're seeing that now. When Stratford canceled their season last week, they said, our budget is 76 million, but the economic spin-offs to Stratford are 135, 150 million or so. And certainly when I go to Stratford, I go to restaurants and all the rest.
And Stratford, I love Stratford as an example because Stratford was started in the 1950s as an economic development project for the town of Stratford, because the CN train repair shops were shutting and the town was desperate for some other industry. So from that point of view, Stratford has been a smash hit. It has done what town wanted it to do, right? Put Stratford on the map. So there's that kind of economic argument. And then we kind of went from there into the sort of creative cities argument, which was Richard Florida, talked a lot about the creative class, and people got into the notion that if you wanted to build a city that would attract workers, it needed to have cafes, but it needed to have theaters.
Hipsters. I believe it needed hipsters.
It needed the things hipsters need to survive. So, coffee bars and art house cinemas. So there was that, which was basically just a more sophisticated version of the economic argument. And more recently, we're getting into stuff that is a little more, it's a little more complicated, but as I say, I fear it could become utilitarian. So you're getting into arguments about mental health. And there are a lot of neurological arguments about the arts. The most obvious one being, this is your brain on music, right? And if you look at the Royal Conservatory of Music right now, if you look at their ad campaigns push that point that musical education is sort of good for your kid's brain. The sort of most extreme example of this was Montreal Museum of Fine Art entered into an arrangement with the Quebec Association of Francophone Doctors that the doctors could prescribe free museum visits for people whose mental health they felt would be helped by a museum visit. And I don't know, there's something kind of odd about that's great. The problem will be if someone turns around and says, so how many people have you saved from suicide this week? That's where you get into a problem, is when that position is flipped around. And so how many jobs did you create? Because the only reason you're here is to create jobs. Well, if your only value is as a kind of psychological safety net, then, you know, people could start saying, well, who is it you've saved? So that I hear a kind of utilitarian argument coming forward, and I don't know, we'll see where it goes. It's relatively new, so.
Yeah, and I believe that MMFA partnership, I mean, part of that is they're actually studying. I mean, they're trying to quantify not necessarily how many people they've saved, but some sort of measure of happiness or peacefulness, or certainly at least general mental health.
Yeah. And I mean, those of us who love the visual arts, who love going to museums, like in some ways we know that, right?
Yeah.
After Trump was elected, I wrote a piece, you know, and we were all kind of in like, oh my God, how did that happen? And I wrote a piece about going to the Art Gallery of Ontario and spending time with Anthony Caro's sculptures, which are these 1960s great big hunks of steel that are completely abstract. Right. And just about how that gives me peace, really. So it's not that I don't believe in it as a phenomena. I do believe in it as a phenomena. I think the trouble is sometimes if you pin things down in that way, you find you've sort of boxed yourself into a corner.
You know, there's been a lot of talk over the past few weeks, especially, it seems to me, that about other communities in North America having already experienced a pandemic. I'm speaking, of course, about the gay community in the early 80s. And the way that community responded with art that spoke about their experience that may have something to teach us now, and what's fascinating to look back at the kind of art that was produced at specific slices in time. You have the early plays that kind of responded to the immediate crisis, like in 1985. I'm thinking of like The Normal Heart and As Is. And then, a few years on, you had Angels in America, which took, obviously a more expansive view of those. And frankly, actually, films like Longtime Companion, right, which began to quote unquote normalize, that community. And then Rent, big hit in 1996, and you had that stuff, or 1995, I guess, 96. Actually had that on Broadway of all places. I also think of the response of the visual arts community, efforts by General Idea, right, which responded to the AIDS crisis. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, whether there's anything you think that experience can help. Well, here's that word, can teach us now about the experience we're really, frankly, just beginning.
Yeah. I mean, the AIDS crisis was, it was long and slow, right? And this is being short and fast.
Right.
So that's a difference.
Well, frankly, fast so far.
So far, but it's come on to it. Yeah. I mean, it's overwhelmed us very quickly, right? I mean, AIDS created a lot of great art. And I used to say that it created a lot of great art for the same reason, unfortunately, the First World War created a lot of great art. And that is because all of a sudden you have a group of young people confront death.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you have people who are in their artistically most productive years, all of a sudden confront the biggest theme. And usually people don't confront the biggest theme till later in life because you don't start thinking about death till you're older. So you have this and it's very effective. And general ideas art being, classic example, Tony Kushner's Being Angels in America was this epic. So whether the pandemic will do that, this pandemic, I'm not sure. Partly, of course, because it's a different group of people who are dying. I mean, right now, many, many elderly people are dying. And I think whether rightly or wrongly, society tends to take that more in stride.
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing that a few people have talked about, and I don't know much about, I think would be really interesting to find out more about, is that there isn't much about the 1918 flu pandemic. Like there doesn't seem to be, and somebody pointed out that in Mrs. Dalloway, that Mrs. Dalloway's joy in crossing the city as she prepares for her dinner party, that is partly because she would have been in lockdown prior to that.
Oh, really?
I mean, that's just, I just saw that on Twitter, It was
then it must be right.
a really deep piece of literary analysis I read on Twitter. So anyway, when you think about that, there isn't much, like, we don't know much artistically. Like, we know about the trenches artistically, right? We've seen a lot about, but we don't really know much about the flu pandemic, which killed more people in the end. So for some reason, it did not produce art. So we'll have to see whether or not this produces art. I know that one thing that fiction writers are now, whether they're novelists or television writers or screenwriters, are sort of struggling with is, okay, so if I'm setting the action around 2020, is it pre-pandemic? Do I pretend the pandemic didn't happen? Is it post? What's post-pandemic going to look like? So it poses right now, I think, a bit of a problem for artists who are dealing with narrative and literary forms. It might actually be something very more interesting or more accessible for people who are dealing in more abstract forms. I mean, I could see in the visual arts it might be quite powerful right away to start doing work addressing it.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, anything set in 2020 or 2021 may necessarily end up being set in a science fiction realm, because if things are so quote unquote normal, I mean, the one thing we can pretty much guarantee is that things will not be normal a year from now. Let me ask you something. I was struck reading your piece, and I'm just going to read it from it now. One of the things that you wrote was, whether it's at the concert hall or the movie theater, the thing we're missing most of all these days is the crowd. The cinema business, which was already suffering badly in the era of streaming, has been so busy advertising the big screen, the booming sound, or the 3D image, that audiences may have got the impression that watching a movie outside the home is simply a question of superior technology. It is, more importantly, an occasion, an appointment to receive the film as a member of a community. Now, you kind of flicked at that a little, if you will, when you were talking about, maybe going to see Come From Away or going to Broadway or dressing up. But I think one of the things that I was struck by when in reading that was, and you've got a kid, I think a teenager. I have 3 at home. Frankly, I'm kind of stunned that they've managed to stay out of this office for as long as we have, though we've still got another 40.
BBC guy.
What's that?
I said you have yet to become BBC guy, with the kid crawling into the interview. Yes.
Yeah. But when you watch, we'll just say, generally speaking, younger people watching TV, and it could be something that they're streaming, something on Netflix, or it could be live TV, though there's less and less of that being watched, certainly in my household. they're always on two screens, right? And at least two screens. And as somebody who's old, that has always frustrated me, because I think, you should just watch the damn show. Okay, just focus on the piece of art.
TV. You take TV seriously?
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. But I've realized, reading your observation, I realized how dumb I've been all this time, because of course what they were doing was creating that communal experience, and it didn't have to be going to the opera, it didn't have to be going to Broadway. They were creating that communal experience at home and in the homes of their friends, across the neighborhood or across the city, or frankly, across the world. And so I wonder, I mean, what's, the implication there, of course, is that the art itself, the quality of the art itself, may be less important than the fact that it just gives us that ritual, that thing, something we can talk about.
Yeah, sort of water cooler culture, right? And in
Yeah.
the way back in the days of appointment television, everyone was talking, hence the name water cooler, that
Right.
everyone talked about it the next morning. And I remember, I mean, when I was in high school, people literally did that. They would
Yes.
come together in the morning at their lockers and talk about the show they watched last night. And they'd all watch the same show because there were only 3 shows to watch. So, whereas now people can't do that and there's that phenomena of creating the community around the televised event without having the community. It's a virtual community, right? So,
Yep.
I mean, I guess because I'm not a teenager and so I don't do that, the one I see more obviously are things like the Oscars, say, where people are tweeting to each other as they watch, and so they're reacting as they. And it's. I mean, we used to sometimes have Oscar parties, and there's sports you can watch that way too, right? It doesn't take your undivided attention. You can chit chat over top of each other, so it becomes a kind of social thing. So but then there's also, a few years back, I talked to an American art consultant who had this observation about theater and about sort of the future of theater that was had been very influential amongst, I think, American cultural executives. And he'd done focus groups with young people. And one of the people in one of his focus groups had said of theater, why would I want to go and sit in the dark and watch something without being able to talk to my friends? And so this was in the era, do you remember tweet seats? Tweet seats were
right.
Yes, I think that's gone out, but you'd have some seats at the back of theater where you were allowed to be on social media and be disruptive and have the light on your phone, while the old fogies could sit at the front of the theater and not be bothered by you, because you apparently could not experience this without saying something to somebody. So there's sort of protocols and rituals in any kind of group art form, so in the theater, but also the movie theater. So the movie theater, now there are ads saying, don't be a whatever Sally, and shut up, turn your phone off. So there always seems to be social tension over sort of whose protocols and whose rituals are the right ones and the ones we should be using at the moment. And so, I finished with that picture of the Globe Theater, and the Globe Theater tries to reproduce what an audience would have felt like in Shakespeare's time. It would have been noisier. It would have had more food. It would have been rude by our standards.
Yeah.
Some of those people will be standing, and people who are standing are going to be less self-contained because they're going to get twitchy. So it would be quite a different experience, and they try to reproduce that. Seems a bit fake in a way. I don't know if you can sort of step back in time that way. But so I think we always have these tension points over how the ritual works, but I don't think the rituals are going away.
Let me ask you this, something that I don't think you touched on. We're like right now, we are on the internet. We are accessible in theory to people across the world. I worked on a piece that was in last Saturday's paper with Marshall Lederman about how literary festivals are responding to the fact that they're not able to stage their events in person. I spoke with somebody at the Eden Mills Literary Writers Festival, which of course is a much loved writers festival. Usually takes place in September. just outside of Guelph. And they are moving to something that I will say is not dissimilar to the event we're having now. They're going to be going to a kind of curated every 2 weeks event through the summer, but which is frankly fantastic. And I was cheered. I mean, I just thought it was wonderful because the artistic director, among the other things that she said to me, was she had watched a book launch that was actually was live, took place in a bar outside of Stratford. She was at her home at the time in Toronto, and her mother-in-law was in Queensland, Australia. And they watched this book launch and then talked about it, an hour later. And it is actually a fantastic book launch, which is still available on Facebook. But I'm struck by the fact that, and obviously there are enormous benefits to this technology, but we are, it seems, not giving much thought at the moment into this kind of onrushing embrace of the global culture, right? Because if all of us can watch the same thing at once, I'm concerned by, for example, one of the artistic directors I spoke with is the director of the Cabot Trail Writers Festival, which takes place in October. And they are, and this is kind of, I think, quite interesting, because of the spotty internet out on Cape Breton, they may not be going to a virtual festival. They may be gathering in smaller groups, or they may in fact be using, would you believe it or not, local television or local radio to host their events, which is fantastic. I think going not hyper local, but more local as everybody else is going global. So I mean, are you at all concerned about this kind of onrushing for everybody to get their stuff out there, and possibly losing what is special about, frankly, broadly speaking, local culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what is going to happen because of this period where live arts have been cut off is there's some things that will come back and we will re-embrace passionately. And one of the ones we might discuss is the rock concert, because I think that might be an interesting case to discuss. Then the flip side, I think, is that some trends that were already happening are going to be accelerated, and the most obvious one being a whole bunch of new subscribers went out and signed up for Netflix, and that streaming and that, I mean, the distinction between television and film had already been breaking down. Movie theaters were already running into troubles to find people who want to see a movie as part of an audience rather than at home. And I think that will be accelerated. And I think the way in which the Oscars have been, holding out the pure standard bearers of the theatrical experience for film, I think you're going to see even more pressure on that front, to start recognizing that streaming is a legitimate way to launch a film. The example, though, I would go to, which I find quite interesting, is that of the Metropolitan Opera's broadcasts. I know lots of people for whom those broadcasts, which are done by Cineplex, so you have to go out of the home. You have to go out of the home to see them. And there was a lot of discussion of what the impact that is on opera. That all of a sudden you can see the best opera in the world at your local Cineplex. And of course, you have to add here that now the Met has, in the current situation, made those freely available online. So you now don't even have to go to Cineplex to see them. You can see them at home. So one of the discussions about that amongst arts administrators and stuff is, when they do that, are they cannibalizing their own audience? And the answer to that seems to be no. The number of people who have enough money to go to New York to see the opera will still do that. That's a pretty special thing to do, and there will still be that attraction. And for a New York audience who don't have to pay for accommodation are already there, there'll still be that sense that the live experience is worth it and worth the expense. So they're not cannibalizing their own audience. What they are probably doing is killing smaller opera companies in other communities. Because if you can see the Met at the Cineplex or at home, are you going to see your much smaller little local opera company perform on stage live. And I would say one perhaps victim of that was Opera Lyra in Ottawa, which is a semi-professional opera that had existed, a small company existed for many years in Ottawa and went bust a couple of years ago. So I think there's that phenomena of globalization. And I think it's part of something I've sometimes talked about, which I usually refer to as bestseller culture, because it's a phenomenon of digitization that, because it makes everything available to everybody, but it also makes it's a fire hose of content. And in that fire hose, it's very hard to distinguish what to watch or what to read. And so very few things come to the top. And so what you get is you get one thing that is a massive hit, and then there's this whole big massive stuff that nobody ever discovers. You see that in publishing. I mean, that's why I talk about it as a bestseller culture, because I think it's most obvious in publishing. Everybody's reading the same book, and that started with Harry Potter. And I remember when the Harry Potter phenomenon really got going, you talk to people who would be very critical of it, and they try and find things to criticize about the book. And I always found their criticisms of the books were kind of a stretch, and were quite snobby sometimes and whatever. And I realized at a certain point, no, what they're really uncomfortable with is the fact every kid is reading this book. It's not just it's a popular book, it's every kid is reading it. And so there's that phenomena. So we'll all be watching the Met. And yeah, it's great opera, but what about the other opera companies? And so there is that phenomena of the push towards the global, which we're seeing already and maybe accelerated. The flip side of that is, as a Canadian, obviously, I feel very strongly we need the local, because in global terms, for Canadians, the local is Canadian as opposed to, Hollywood, and that we need local stories, and that we need a sense that this is something that happens here in our community. And so your example of the Cape Breton Festival, to me, that's going to probably feel a little more real. Even if it's on radio, I think it's going to feel a little more real than sitting here saying, oh, I'm going to sit here in Toronto and see what's going on at the Vancouver Writers Festival and see if that's, what I don't know. I mean, this may, as we get out of crisis, this may change. But for me, all these online experiences, I'm not, it's so easy to tune out, to leave the room, to be interrupted. What we were talking about earlier, there just isn't that sense of occasion. And without occasion, I'm not sure I'm going to stay. So I actually think the small and the local may become very important as well.
Well, before you continue talking about how people leave these online events and not stick around
yes.
to the end, I should say, it looks as if we've got about 27, 28. Oh, I can't remember whether we're going to 8:30 or 8:40. But in any case, I'm going to go to the Q&A
Okay.
because people have been waiting very patiently to have their questions read. So let me just read the first one, which frankly seems fascinating. Not that the others aren't, but let me read this one. This from somebody writes in, I remember attending a writer's workshop at Humber School for Writers in 2007. At that time, nonfiction was far outselling fiction, at least according to what we were told. A change that was attributed to the impact of September 11th and its aftermath. People felt that they were already living in a, quote, science fiction world, so were more interested in true stories than in fictional ones. That was at least the explanation at the time. So here we are again, back in a sci-fi world. Will we see a quick shift in reading preferences to nonfiction? Or more generally, what kind of storytelling will readers and viewers and listeners look for? Any sense, Kate?
Well, obviously, one thing that happens when major news events happen is people turn to nonfiction because they're looking for very direct information and meaning at that level. And I think I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that analysis that it's about, oh, the world has become fiction, so now I'm going to read nonfiction instead of reading fiction. I think it's about it's about sort of information seeking versus escapism seeking, or not that. I think there's very, very important information in fiction. I think there's information about human life and human emotion. And I think it's information people use, but they don't obviously go out and use it the next day in the street the way you use the information in the newspaper. So if you still read a newspaper.
Everybody's reading us online, Kate. We don't care about the medium.
I don't know. I mean, I have heard that right now books are doing pretty well, actually, like fiction is doing pretty well, because people are at home and have time on their hands and want to read books. But I guess longer term, we'll have to see. You do get in this, I mean, I feel that ever since Trump was elected, that, you become this kind of news junkie, and, all I read are newspapers, magazines, and you wind up, I mean, I'll read the New Yorker, say, and so I'll read articles about American politics because I'm worried about that, but then I'll wind up reading other nonfiction pieces because they happen to be sitting there. And so you kind of get into that. And then it can become a real relief to go into fiction and to go into a world that is in which the information is of a different quality and the experience is of a different quality. So I'm not, I don't know about that one. Certainly my hope as a lover of fiction and as an occasional writer of fiction is that it will come out of this stronger, not weaker. But who knows?
One person asks, says live theater creates a synergy between actors and audience, and of course each performance is different. This synergy is not the same in film or in books. Can you give me a sense of how important that crowd synergy is? I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, sure. That goes back to what I was saying about risk taking. The actors are taking literal, physical, or sort of emotional and professional risks right in front of you. What happens if they forget their lines? I mean, that's why the important thing about theater is you are in the same room as them, as their bodies. I used to say that the most important thing in the Phantom of the Opera was the moment where the chandelier came crashing down and just about hit the audience over the head, because it was like, hey, you're in a real space where real things are happening, as opposed to watching something on a screen. And actors are taking that incredible risk for you. And when I was a theater critic and went to theater, 4 nights a week, bad, good, indifferent, I always felt hugely energized. It was one of the most sort of, for me, energetic periods of my life. And I, in retrospect, attributed to the fact that I was engaging in this social ritual many, many times a week. And there was always this sense of being part of something and being part of society. As I say, whether the theater was, even if the play was bad, there was that sense that you were part of something. So the joke in the theater community right now is, theater's been dying for 4,000 years or whatever it is. So still dying.
I still dying, right. I'm not dead yet. I will say, Kate, you're a better theater critic than I ever was, because frankly, the idea that you were energized by bad theater is...
bad theater. Well, I was energized by good theater too,
Sure, yes, but boy,
I always take it as the real sign of a real arts lover if they go to something that's appallingly bad and they come out with all kinds of things to say, and and they feel the experience was worthwhile, even if they did not feel the art was worthwhile.
Sure, but I would usually come out of bad stuff just angry. Certainly not unenergized. Anyway, one question that's come in, a really interesting one. Doesn't your chronology that you've laid out tell us that the arts are us? That is, that art creation and the hunger for art is an essential component of the human condition?
Yeah, sure. And that's, I guess, why I start with cave paintings, right? Because I say, you're going back to a time where we don't know who these people are. We don't know how they managed to survive, but we know they made art.
Right.
So that's my feeling, is it's sort of in our DNA somehow.
Somebody asks, do you think in the near future, and frankly, who knows what's going to happen in the near future, that is to say, post-pandemic, do you think that boards of education will rethink their arts courses And maybe it's not so much a prediction as whether they should rethink their arts courses such as instrumental programs or music
Mhm.
programs being better funded and better supported. And, noting that in stressful times, children need the arts. And before you answer that, I will say, at least here in Ontario, we all thought that, one of the big shifts was going to be a move to online education. Well, now I think
Yeah,
we've,
yeah. I'm gonna be rethinking that one.
yeah.
I don't.
And so if we are rethinking that one, and frankly, maybe there's more money for the arts, which frankly
Yeah,
don't need a lot of money anyway.
yeah. I don't. I think that battle is continual of that sense that in education you need all these. I mean, this is the point of the Socrates project, right? That in education you need more than just the sort of practical, teach the kids coding stuff, right?
Right.
You also need all these other things that just sort of enlarge the spirit and are maybe difficult to put these precise definitions of what it is they're achieving. And, the obvious one being music programs in schools. And I certainly feel sorry that stuff has been cut the way it has over the years. I think it hugely enriches the children's education. And I think often people learn this while they're off doing that learning isn't an absolute straight street. I've had a great deal of sympathy with parents you're hearing from who are saying this distance learning stuff, forget it. I'm going to let the kids do what they want to do. And I certainly, with my son who's in grade 10, the good stuff that's happening in our household right now is his own stuff that he's choosing to learn, not the stuff that's coming, over the computer.
You mean like him setting up your lighting rig
Yeah,
and your
set
microphone
up the
rig?
lighting rig. If I'm well lit, he's playing his guitar a lot.
Yeah, that's very good. I wonder if part of the kind of never-ending apprehension of governments toward funding the arts or supporting the arts is that the arts are often a form of rebellion or protest. And one of the questions that's come in, and this actually reminds me of the response of the gay community again to the arts, to the AIDS pandemic. But one of the questions that's come in is the arts are also needed for protest, for questioning authority, and for rabble rousing, and I think you flicked at this, they're for proposing new realities and new ways of being. Wondering if you want to draw that out a little
Yeah,
more.
that's a continual tension in the arts. I think it's a historic tension, and I think it's one you see to this day between, that sense of a small, ill-paid community that is at the vanguard of all sorts of ideas and changes in society, and then the very, very wealthy people they need to support them. And there's a fabulous Swedish film called The Square, which is a satire which was at TIFF a couple of years ago, that's a satire about the contemporary visual art world. And it spells that relationship out so acutely, about where you have all these crazy radicals creating the most outlandish art, and then you have all these very, very rich people who've got to be convinced that they've got to in fact fund the revolution that will overthrow them. So it's just a really clever, it's the only time I've seen on film someone actually address that issue, and I think that's an ongoing issue. And I think you see that tension quite often in the States with culture wars, where people start saying, why are we funding this stuff? It's subversive. And so that's a kind of and I guess one of the problems with turning to government funding as opposed to previous funding models like traditional religious patronage or something is that you get into that, you then can become sometimes a creature of the state, and that poses its own issues.
The Square actually was fantastic, and I probably
Wonderful.
I probably shouldn't promote this, but last time I looked, it was on Netflix. So, but
Really? I should have get. Okay.
But having said that, those who are watching us right now should not hop off immediately to go watch The Square. But yeah, it's excellent. One question that's come in, it says, doesn't seem as if we're going to get the physical community when it comes to the arts anytime soon.
No.
What are some of the ways that we can do to help create that same community feeling, albeit virtually, in the months to come? Or frankly, is it even possible?
I don't know. I mean, everybody gets community in their own way, right? And some people clearly find a sense of community on social media. Um, and I'm really intrigued. I don't think I have an answer to that question, but I'm quite intrigued by it as a proposition because so there are going to be two issues about opening up. One is when will your particular province let you open up, since it's mainly a provincial responsibility. So when will the government of Ontario tell the Royal Ontario Museum or the AGO or the Tarragon Theatre, it's okay, as long as you do some social distancing, you can have your doors open and sell tickets. So that's one issue. But then the other issue, which all the arts organizations are having to look at, is will people feel comfortable coming back? And from that point of view, you might think, okay, smaller things will do better. And but also I wonder if things that traditionally attract younger audiences will do better, because I think seniors right now are, for very good reason, being very, very cautious, right? So that may be an issue. So something like Stratford, where the audience tends to be older, might have more of a problem. That said, the things that I could see people just really hungry for and just rushing to is the kind of rock concert phenomena. And I think we mentioned earlier that's a good example to talk about, because that's the crowd just in its most basic kind of form. I mean, next to a sporting event, and I don't know what's going to happen in sports, but in the arts, that's the closest to it, of that kind of raw crowd energy, in that sense that music lets us feel emotions we wouldn't otherwise feel, and express them with a group. And on the other hand, rock concerts are presumably about the most dangerous of the various arts events you could think of, because they're the biggest. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but it will be interesting to see what people charge for and what they stay away from.
One of the things, and I think I actually included this in that piece that Marsha and I wrote, was that the artistic director of the Ottawa Writers Festival said to me that his two primary constituencies are older people. They either volunteer or they attend the Writers Festival, and university students. And
Right.
so you've got the super spreaders and the super vulnerable. Which is a super bad mix. It was a perfect storm, certainly for writers' festivals, and frankly for for events such as Stratford Festival, Shaw Festival. A lot of that kind of summer theater. Having said that, one person has just written in to say, given the comeback that, and I guess this is a question of speculating, but let's go ahead. Given the comeback that live performances have made throughout history, after all, venues were closed during plagues before, during, and after Shakespeare's time, or after all venues were closed and 50 million people died from the Spanish flu, why do we think that live performances will not make a similar comeback in our eventual future? This person adds, so let's please consider this question. What should we be doing to protect the artists and companies in the arts sector so that they're alive when audiences eventually return? So I guess that's a twofold question. I don't know if you want to take both.
Well, I mean, the obvious thing that Stratford has been asking people to do is don't cash in your tickets. Is just let us keep the money.
Right. Yesterday, there was a big Giving Tuesday campaign.
Yeah. So, so that's the obvious one. I mean, I've sort of just on kind of micro level been spending in local businesses where I feel like, oh, I don't want that restaurant not to be here when I come back, so let's get takeout, So there's that element of not cashing in your tickets, and then the minute it's open again, spending basically and buying tickets. I think there are going to be bailouts needed. I think maybe some of the smaller institutions will be okay because they're pretty nimble, and people might feel quite comfortable going to a show with 50 people, say. Whereas I think the bigger institutions will be in trouble. And I think that museums and galleries will be able to figure out ways of doing some distancing, whereas that becomes a bit more difficult in theater. But long term, no, I don't think performance is going anywhere. I think there'll always be that element of for, I guess, all the reasons we've talked about, of a desire, of a human desire for performance and to see performance. So I wouldn't expect it to disappear. I think it may just take time to come back. And one of the things also in all these discussions is, we talk about the big abstract level, and the big sort of at the big picture level, a particular form is not going to die. It's, when you're the artistic director of Theater X, and Theater X is definitely going to die, there's that. So we may see a huge changeover, a loss of a generation, that kind of stuff, which at the micro level is exceedingly upsetting for those involved. At the macro level, theater's been dying since the Greeks and will continue to do so.
And frankly, at the macro level, many of my friends in the arts, it's not as if they're going to rush out and start going to coding or developing, other. I mean, I would hope that some of them have side hustles, and they have other ways of surviving. They may have to get back up, as we're going to be hungry to watch them or listen to them or hear them perform. Can you hear me? Sorry, I just.
Yeah, so you broke up a little bit there, but
Okay.
yeah, I mean, people will have to be inventive, but artists have always been inventive, and artists have always been driven to create what they do, rather than, if they really cared about being wealthy, they'd have become corporate lawyers, and they didn't. They're artists. So there's this element that they're driven to create whatever it is they're creating, rather than, and then, figuring out how to make a go of it kind of comes second. So I don't think it, I mean, you get in these sort of twisted kind of situations all the time, considering the arts in Canada. I mean, Canadians right now, in the past couple of years, statistically, you and I know this because we worked on a story about it, are reading a lot fewer Canadian books. This presumably is because they're not finding Canadian books they used to, because of the discoverability issue, that there's this, as I said, this fire hose of content. And so it's only the sort of bestsellers that kind of get the attention. And so that isn't, in the grand scheme of things, this unwritten Canadian novel or that failed Canadian novel is not the end of the world. In the grand scheme of things, in the little local scheme of things, that's really bad for the writing community in this country. And you lose something in dialogue in any city if you don't have that going on. So it's kind of, I think the big picture is okay. I think all the different little pictures, there may be some really unhappy moments.
I don't know if you want to speak to this. This is something that came up, as you were speaking, because we were talking about escapism and thrillers, and of course, high art as well. The Sistine Chapel. Are you suggesting that entertainment, diversions are art? Are they art? If not, then, and I don't know whether you could write books on this, but what do you think distinguishes art from entertainment?
I don't think there is. I mean, I think it's this huge. Well, there's a huge panoply of stuff, and there's this long line, and where is it you draw the line? And I find attempts to define art don't really go anywhere. So on the whole, I tend to be expansive. I don't, I wouldn't make a distinction between diversion and art, and what diverts some people bores others, and what some people think is highly artistic, other people think is crap. So it's really not, it's not a distinction I would make. I just talking about a whole range of human expression, really.
Have you spoken to anybody, by the way, at museums or galleries about how they could conceivably reopen, whether it's the Hamilton Art Gallery or here in Toronto, the AGO, because they certainly are talking about possibly reopening in whether it's a late summer or September.
That's kind of my assignment for next week. I was
there
just about to start working on that. I mean, yes, I hear that museums in Asia and some parts of Europe are starting to reopen, and they're starting to reopen with some forms of distancing and hand washing and, you know, hand sanitizer and whatever. And I imagine that they're starting to look at that kind of stuff. But timeline, I don't know. People seem now to be talking kind of September.
Yeah, although who knows? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
plenty of things have to happen, and who knows what is going to enable us to come back. So I think we've got a few more minutes. So if other people have questions to get them in now. But let me ask this one question. Somebody's asked, and you've sort of answered this, but how do you think smaller theaters will survive when the public is able to return to theaters? Will the Mirvishes or other theater venues have to cut their ticket numbers from, say, 1,500 to now, you know, a venue of 500? Will they charge more to see pop productions with a smaller ticket revenue, like, you know, Hamilton or Come From Away? Before you answer that, I mean, you know, if you actually do the math and you plot it out geometrically, you're not even talking about possibly, you know, selling half the tickets, because really, if you want a 6-foot radius, you're talking about selling, you know, 1/10 of the tickets.
Yeah, and it doesn't really, I mean, most theaters break even at the 75% capacity, kind of round there. Usually you've got to have 80% capacity making money.
Right.
Uh, I don't know. I don't know how that's going to work. The notion that, you know, you and your partner will sit in these 2 seats, and then there'll be 2 empty seats, and then there'll be, you know, like, I don't know. I don't know, and I don't see how a very, very expensive productions like Hamilton can work on that kind of model. Whereas I do see how a small theater uh, could could sort of make a go of it and work around it. I also see how outdoor theater could work, because of course we're told that transmission outdoors is much less dangerous. So I could, or much less likely. So I could definitely see how it seems too late for this year's summer theaters, but I could see how outdoor theater would feel a lot more comfortable.
Right, so maybe Bard on the Beach, you think perhaps
Bard on
canceled?
Beach in February, I think, is looking good.
There we go. Very nice. So let's see. I think we may have a couple more questions. So so I don't know whether you can answer this one, but somebody's asked about actors at Stratford. Are part-time employees and have been cut loose with no compensation. I'm actually not entirely certain about that, but this questioner says, I'm sure this is true for most professional actors. How, you know, can you speak about how they should be compensated? I mean, my understanding is, you know, and I've been covering sports over the last little while, you know, a lot of the athletes, whether they're tennis pros or golf pros, frankly, they are also, they don't have access to their usual source of funding, which is prize money. And they're applying to the Canada Emergency, Fund,
Yeah,
CERB. Go ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say, I think everyone's in the same boat, right? They've got to
Yeah.
apply to the emergency fund. That's all. You know, that's the only thing available to them.
Yeah.
And there was that initial phase where it seemed that the government didn't understand the way arts careers work, and that you might keep going with some small gig, but you'd lost your main source of income. But I think they fixed that loophole so that you're not discouraged from having some kind of, sort of something that's bringing in some money, but still able to take the emergency benefit.
Right. Well, as one person has pointed out, maybe we'll see a return to community theater, which of course doesn't depend on big box office. And, you know, kind of frankly, that kind of flicks back to what I was mentioning at Cape Breton Writers Festival. Having said that, you know, artists do need to get paid. So I'm not sure exactly how that works. But I do wonder if we're going to see a kind of, you know, grassroots movement of more community-based arts.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing you've seen, you've always seen in both the visual arts and the performing arts is exactly that, is like the first grads out of school kind of saying, well, I can't get in anywhere, so I'm going to make my own fun. And incredibly dynamic things have risen out of that impetus. So there may be an element of that, of exactly what you're saying, that kind of real grassroots, small scale because small scale is more affordable, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, we are coming up on 8:30, and so unless there's something in particular that that you think I've forgotten to ask about.
I know we seem to have covered an awful lot. So
All right. So listen, what I'd like to say is I should mention that you know, as I said, this is part of the Socrates project of Master University. And the next event, 2 weeks from now, is on May 20th. It features an international panel led by McMaster's Institute on Ethics and Policy for Innovation, and they'll be discussing how extreme emergencies and crises influence our normal research ethics and protocols. So register now and tune in 2 weeks from now. And so frankly, with that, Kate, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank McMaster for the opportunity to mull all of these ideas, and to be honest, to see you know, the Cave of Lascaux again, and some of those other pictures that you showed us, because there is it was quite lovely just to kind of take that time to look at these places that we can't currently visit, and to think about you know, the role of them in our lives. So I hope everybody who has tuned in has enjoyed this evening's presentation. And now I would say now to the bar, but frankly, Kate, now to your own bar, and I shall repair to mine. So thank you all very much.
thank you, Simon.